Budget Implementation Omnibus Bill, known as C-4, is a big chunk of legislation. And by big chunk, I mean it runs 321 pages. Now, you'd think that a bill like this would be providing all kinds of fodder for discussion in the House of Commons. But the government limited debate on C-4, and MPs ripped through the whole thing in just 4 days. 4 days doesn't seem like much time to get through all that legislation, so over the next few weeks, we're going to dig into some of the most contentious corners of the omnibus bill and organize our own debates. Now, some unions are already raising red flags about proposed labor law changes in the bill. Amendments to the Public Service Labor Relations Act could dramatically change the relationship between the government and thousands of its employees. The new law would give the government new power to define workers as essential, limiting their right to strike. New rules around arbitration would give the government the power to make contract settlements based on the, quote, prudent use of public funds. The government says the new law will protect public safety and help keep public sector wages in line with its fiscal policy. Critics say the changes could take away the bargaining rights of thousands of public service workers, and we're going to hear from both sides of that debate today. Edith Bramwell is Coordinator of Representation for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. She is in our Ottawa studio. Howard Levitt is a labor and employment lawyer, and he's in our Toronto studio. Hello to you both.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
And thanks for joining us. Edith Bramwell, let me begin with you. One of the most significant changes in this bill is the change in the definition of essential services. The government says it needs to do this to protect the safety and security of Canadians. Why shouldn't government have that power to make those changes?
Oh, we absolutely believe that government should have the power to protect certain services which it provides to Canadians as essential. The thing is, the government has that power right now under the Public Service Labor Relations Act. What the changes that C-4 will bring in will do is actually remove the accountability which used to exist with respect to government actions around essential services by giving the government as an employer unlimited control over how many services are or are not declared essential.
And what impact will that have on your members?
Well, I think it has a twofold impact on our members. It has the impact on our members as workers, as employees, that it will change the way negotiations are carried out, and it will affect their ability to strike. What we're seeing in C-4, I think, is sore loser legislation. This government tried under the current regime to say that it should have an unfettered right with regard to essential services. It lost at the Labor Board, and then it lost at the federal court. So now it's essentially rewriting those losses to make itself completely unaccountable, and I don't think that's in the interests of Canadians.
Now, Howard Levitt, critics point to the example of the Air Canada labor dispute to show that the government is already too willing to shut down collective bargaining. I'm wondering, why does the government need a broader definition of essential services to short-circuit labor action?
Well, first of all, it's not a broader definition. It's a more limited definition. It's a definition of essential services, and if the union has a problem with that, and they have to be advised what are essential months in advance of negotiations under the new legislation, they can challenge that. That's what the minister said, Flaherty, when he introduced it. They could go to judicial review and said this person is not essential. So it's not as unlimited as my friend might have it. But the reality is this, as I see it. My friend refers to it as sore loser legislation. And she's right in a different respect than she postulated. The government, the taxpayers, have been losing the battle of a public service for a very long time, and if this bill redresses it, that's just great. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business in 2008 did a study. Government workers, my friend's members, earn 41.7% more than their private sector equivalents. And in wages, just 17.3%, but pensions and benefits make up the difference. And if this helps redress the imbalance, that's great, because I can't, in good conscience, and I don't think most Canadians in good conscience, can accept a situation where the people we pay our tax dollars to employ make more than the rest of us do for the same jobs.
Edith Bramwell, how do you react to that?
Well, I mean, this is the same misinformation that we've been hearing from the Harper government. The most recent report of the Parliamentary Budget Officer indicates that the salary gap between the public sector and the private sector in Canada is in fact extremely minimal. And public sector salary gains over the last decade have barely kept up with inflation, and in some cases not done so. I'm not sure why the Harper government and the people who espouse its views are so committed to making unions, and in particular public sector unions, their whipping boys.
The reality is the private sector workers have also largely not met inflation in the last 10 years. The present imbalance is still 41.7%. My friend may say, well, it's really very narrow, but that's just referring to wages. Private sector employees don't have gold-plated defined benefit pensions. They don't have the generous benefits. They don't have the shorter hours of work. I mean, that is the reality. And it makes no sense economically for public sector employees to be paid by our tax dollars more than we're making ourselves, and have shorter work weeks, and have better benefits, and have better pensions. And one of the things I like about this legislation is it says there's two things arbitrators have to take into consideration. The first one is, what will it cost to attract a new employee into the public sector? I suspect a lot less than it does now. Secondly, what will it take to retain employees in the public sector? Again, I suspect much less than it does than they're paying now. And thirdly, what's the government's ability to pay? What's its budgetary goals and guidelines? I mean, McGuinty, provincially in Ontario, said there'll be a freeze because their public sector workers are also so overpaid. And the arbitrators went ahead and awarded dramatically more than private sector employees were paying, even with that mandate, because it had no teeth. Now there's some teeth. So, and that's great for Canadians.
So then, Edith Bramwell, I mean, Howard Levitt mentioned it. The government can now make the case that its offer to its employees is based on what's called in this act a prudent use of public funds. What could be wrong with making sure that the government is being careful with tax dollars when it signs labor deals?
Once again, the requirement that public funds, that budgetary considerations be paramount in the mind of somebody who is an arbitrator or on the board of a public interest commission, that was contained in the old legislation. There is no need for a legislative change in that regard. But I just want to correct some of the things that Howard is saying. Howard is saying that the new bill creates requirements for fairness and requirements for there to be considerations around retention when an arbitral award is made. That's actually untrue. Those were requirements under the old Act at Section 148D and Section 175D of the Public Service Labor Relations Act. This new bill gets rid of those requirements.
It does not.
Longer. Well, I'm sorry, I've got the bill in front of me, but
So do I. There's two factors. That's one of them.
There are two factors that are mandatory. The only two that are mandatory are the prudent use of public funds, and this is the one that I think the public needs to know about. It's a requirement that we see terms and conditions of employment that are sufficient to meet operational requirements. So this government has said goodbye to the sort of commitment to excellence and high standards that has been a hallmark of the Canadian public service for decades. We're now talking about sufficiency. We're talking about a bargain basement federal public service. Personally, I think Canadians deserve better.
That's just rhetoric. I mean, the two mandatory requirements now are, one, paying enough to attract and keep workers, and secondly, considering the budgetary requirements of the government. Those are the only two factors now. Before there were five, and the other three were the ones that were used to overcompensate employees relative to the private sector equivalents and relative to their market power.
Howard Levitt.
Yes.
An opinion piece in the Law Times says that these changes will effectively neuter the bargaining rights of the affected members of the public sector. And there have been criticisms that these arbitration boards under this new legislation will no longer be independent. How can it be a good thing to tilt bargaining powers so far in favor of one side?
Well, first of all, they're already in favor of one side, the union side, which is why the unions have done so well in the public sector, why they have 70% union membership in the public sector and 17% in the private sector, and declining almost by the month. That's simply an opinion and nothing more than that. You're stating it as if it were a fact. it changes bargaining rights. It certainly changes bargaining power, but it moderates it back to an even equilibrium where there won't be the disproportionality that there has been presently, which is frankly causing a citizen revolt across the country. It's responsible for Mayor Ford's election. It's responsible for McGuinty's tough position, which Wynne, of course, is undermining now.
Edith Bramwell, when she was Labour Minister, Lisa Raitt suggested that the economy itself should be considered an essential service. I'm wondering how you respond to the argument that the government should have the power to end labor disruptions that threaten economic growth in this country. Well,
I just think that that's approaching the horse from the wrong end, if I can put it that way. The goal of balanced labor legislation, good labor legislation, like we see in vibrant economies all over the world, is to promote collective agreements which lead to labor peace and stability. That is the goal of good labor legislation. The sort of pitting of unionized workers against non-unionized workers that you hear coming from Howard, that's a very artificial battle that doesn't reflect the reality of the way in which better working conditions are gained. Things like a 7-hour or 8-hour working day, things like a 5-day work week, which we think are fair working conditions for Canadians, those came to the whole Canadian population through the gains that were made first by union workers. Unions help promote a stable economy. I mean, that is the point of view of the World Bank. That is the point of view of the OECD. These are not left-wing fringe organizations. This is the view of most international organizations and governments who want to see healthy economies in their countries.
It's not the view of most successful governments. And let me just say this.
That's just an area where we'll agree to disagree.
Fine, but let's look at how this starts. If you're a private sector worker in a union, you can't ask for too much, because if you ask for too much, the company will be put out of business, will be rendered uncompetitive. Market discipline plays a role in that balance. In the government, it's reversed. That's what's led to the problem. First of all, the government can just print and does print more money, so they earn more without that market discipline than they would in the private sector. And secondly, instead of having the business owners who stand to lose their business if they offer too much and become uncompetitive, negotiating the table, you have politicians negotiating the table, and their only interest is getting reelected, and they don't want to strike on their watch. So that's what's happened. In the old days, workers in the public sector, they didn't earn as much, but they had better benefits, better working conditions, shorter work week, and that was the balance. You went to the public sector, you didn't work as hard, but you had better benefits and more job security. Now they have higher wages too, and that's an imbalance that just isn't acceptable to Canadians who are paying people doing the same thing as them, union and non-union alike, with their tax dollars.
Thank you, both of you, for joining us.
Thank you.
Edith Bramwell is Coordinator of Representation for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. Howard Levitt is a labor and employment lawyer.